this talk on ocean, ice, and global warming. The purpose of this first slide is to make it clear that the bulk of the surface of the planet is in fact sea and not land. We're accustomed to thinking of the world as being made of continents, but in fact the sea takes up about three quarters, nearly three quarters of the surface of the world. The threats to the world from global warming are sea level rise, shrinking ice cover and iced soil areas, frequency of extreme weather events such as cyclones, forest fires and floods and landslides and so on. Altogether a fairly disastrous situation. These two pictures show the condition of the Arctic, first in 1984 and secondly in 2012. You can see that the area covered by these two pictures is vastly different. In 1984, there was very large coverage of the Arctic by ice, and in 2012 it was very much diminished. I'm sure that by now it is much less. By 2050 perhaps there won't be any at all. This is a picture of the north of Canada, quite near the North Pole. You can see the North Pole at the top of the slide. There it is there. And just below it is the Milne Ice Shelf on Ellesmere Island. Last year, that's in 2020, nearly half of this Milne Ice Shelf broke off. It's 4,000 years old, and because of what we've been doing to the world, it has melted and broken off. The result is that there's now a huge island of ice floating in the sea, which will ultimately melt and raise the sea level. This picture shows that the spread of global warming is not even. It is much greater at the top, as you can see here, and much lower at the bottom. In other words, the Arctic has been warming up. That accounts for the fact that you can now see areas which are now grass instead of ice and snow. And it would account for President Putin being able to build airfields where they couldn't be built before. You can see the increase in temperatures on the scale at the bottom, the centigrade scale. The increase is somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees already, and we're trying to limit the world's increase to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. What's causing this heating? It's the greenhouse gases that are generated by human activity. The sorts of things which generate gas are the diesel engines in vessels like this huge container ship you see up here, or from power stations like the Eskom power station, generate huge amounts of carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse gases like methane and chlorofluorocarbons, but they are not as significant as the carbon dioxide. So what the scientists do is convert each of these to carbon dioxide equivalent, and they speak of CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. What can we do about all this carbon dioxide that we're generating? Well, nature has a cure. There are plants in the ocean, like these mangroves, which actually absorb carbon dioxide and help to keep the balance. Unfortunately, the balance is being upset by the amount of CO2 that we are generating in our own activities. There are other plants. There is, for example, the seagrass, uh, which provides both carbon and nutrient sequestration. Uh, Seagrass makes up only about 0.1% of the ocean floor, but it accounts for about 15% of the total burial of carbon. So you can see there's a really powerful need for there to be a great deal of seagrass around. In fact, the amount of seagrass around is being rapidly diminished, and a couple of universities, the University of William and Mary in Tennessee and the University of Swansea in Wales, have their students planting seagrass in an attempt to remedy the situation. Here's another uh, plant or set of kinds of plant which reduce carbon dioxide. These are marshes, which we see all over the place, of course, and somewhat similar to the wetlands that one sees inland. And they are not only carbon sinks, but of course they are an important habitat for plants and birds and so on. This is my favorite picture. This is what the scientists call a kelp forest, known to most of us, I think, as seaweed. I remember as a boy walking on the beach and slipping on seaweed, very hard, slippery stuff to walk on. The scientists refer to three levels of ocean. They talk about the photic, the dysphotic, and the aphotic. I think we can more easily think of them as the sunlit area, which goes down to 200 meters below the surface, the twilight area, which goes down to 1,000 meters below the surface, and the area where there is no sun at all, right down to the very bottom of the ocean. What actually happens is that the plants I've been speaking of pull the carbon dioxide out of the air and draw it into the sea, into this photic zone, or this sunlit zone. Then, in a miraculous way, nature has all kinds of plants and creatures which facilitate the drawing down of the carbon dioxide down through the twilight zone, all the way through to the bottom of the no sun zone at the very bottom of the ocean. And down here, there is a layer of carbon which has been there for thousands, if not millions of years. Unfortunately, that base is being disturbed by these chaps. These are the fishing vessels which draw their nets along the base of the ocean. They are disturbing the carbon, causing difficulties in keeping the balance between carbon dioxide and the rest of the world. Greenpeace describes the situation in a very alarming way. This is a quotation from Greenpeace. The oceans are in a death spiral from climate change and destructive fishing, with world leaders doing little to stop it. I got this, by the way, from Sky News in June this year. This is a graph showing the carbon dioxide emissions since about 1850. The scientists like to talk about pre-industrial era, which goes back to before then, more like 1750. But you can see from the graph that even in 1850, the amount of emissions was very, very small. This is emissions by people, of course, not natural ones. Very, very small. Even in 1850, the things like the steam engine and so on were only starting to come into use then, and it wasn't until here, this area, before 1900, that you get the diesel engine and the petrol engine, and then up here, up in the 40s and so on, the jet engines, all of which are pumping carbon dioxide into the air in ever increasing volumes. as you can see. Oh, by the way, I should draw to attention to the fact that these lines are not cumulative. These lines represent the amount emitted by humans each year. So we're talking about something like 8 gigatons. That's million tons, if I remember rightly, million tons of carbon per year. It's going up, still going up, even though we've been facing all the warnings that have been given us for such a long time now. The United Nations sometimes issues what it calls an emissions gap report. This is the gap between where we are likely to be at a certain year in the future and where we need to be. They recently issued a new one, 2020. They ask the question, are we on track to bridging the gap? And they give the answer, absolutely not. We are far from achieving the kind of reduction of emission that is required for the survival of the planet. This graph is obtained from NASA. Just notice the black one. It's a bit wiggly, but you can get the trend of it. And it shows the change in the global surface temperature since pre-industrial times. The sort of temperature we're aiming for is 1.5 degrees centigrade, that is. We are already at 1.2. That's about there. I have taken it upon myself to extend the graph in the direction that I think it's going to go. And as you can see, it won't be very long before it reaches 1.5. According to me, according to my calculations, it will be before the year 2030. So our chances of staying within the set limit of 1.5 degrees is very slim. Also, we do not as yet appear to be taking any significant steps to reduce the carbon placed into the atmosphere. One can only hope that when all the representatives of the nations meet in Glasgow in November this year, that they will come to some agreement about the steps that need to be taken. But the steps that need to be taken are not ordinary steps. They are really dramatic steps that have to be taken. The scientists refer to the Paris Agreement, or United Nations refers to the Paris Agreement. This was made in 2015, at which all the nations of the world agreed to limit the increase to below 2 degrees by the end of the century, and if possible, as low as 1.5 degrees. I heard an American expert speaking only recently saying that there is no likelihood that we will achieve either of those, and that in fact her forecast, she was an American professor, her forecast was that we would reach 2.7 by the end of the century, even if we take quite drastic steps. This is a picture of how things are in the United States or near the United States. This is the sea, the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of California. There's California and Oregon and so on. You may recall that Canada recently had temperatures which you're more likely to find in Saudi Arabia, quite astonishingly high temperatures quite recently. And so it's no surprise that in America in general, the situation is pretty bad, as you can see from this map. What's our situation in Africa? Well, this map shows the sea situation. As you can see, the sea here is around the Indian Ocean is already rising very fast, the temperature, and also on the other side of Africa, but all in the area of Central Africa. So the likelihood is that this part of Africa, the central part, the sub-Saharan, the northern sub-Saharan part, will become very hot, very dry, and impossible to live in. The consequence, I believe, is that there will be millions of people trying to make a move down to where we live, in the cooler part. People like this unhappy chap that you can see in this picture. The America has an organization called the Geophysical Fluid Dynamic Laboratory. They have recently produced this picture, March the 30th, 2021, showing a tropical cyclone, and they forecast that there will be more and more tropical cyclones. And if you watch the news, the CNN news, you'll have seen many cyclones occurring in the off the coast and on the coast of the United States in recent times. This isn't strictly the ocean, but it's much nearer home. It is the Okavango Delta, and as you can see, the sorts of things that grow here are the sorts of things we've been speaking of. Greenpeace, this is a Greenpeace advertisement. Greenpeace describe it as nature's air cleaner, and they are asking us, please, to save the Okavango Delta from the oil industry. Would you believe that even at this late stage, the oil industry is planning to drill for oil in this area? Is there any remedy? Well, there's been a lot of talk about electric cars. I picked this advertisement up only a few weeks ago on the internet. This is an electric car already being produced by Hyundai. So somebody's making a big effort. And then, of course, our own South African entrepreneur is producing the Tesla electric car. I understand he's already made a fortune from the sale of electric cars, which is an encouraging sign. If you think the electric car is something pretty grand, as the Americans say, you ain't seen nothing yet. Look at this. This is the world's first zero-emission, crewless cargo ship. It's already running. It emits no CO2, doesn't even have any crew to throw its rubbish into the sea. Quite a remarkable development. Perhaps in a few years we'll see these vessels plying the oceans and emitting no emissions with no crew. Quite astonishing. This is a graph which is produced by NASA, the American, what is it, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, isn't it? They show the various scenarios. You may think I'm a pessimist, but my view is that the path we are on and the path which we are going to continue to follow is this red one, which shows that by the year 2100, we shall be at temperatures well in excess of 4 degrees. The people who are trying to live then will not be living very comfortably. Oh, I've got the wrong button. Oh, there you go. Just before I say anything about this picture, I just want to refer to a novel written by Ernest Hemingway. It's called The Sun Also Rises. In that novel, a character asks another one, how did you go bankrupt? And he got the answer in 2 ways. At first, slowly, then suddenly. For what it's worth, my own prediction of what is going to happen to the world is that we shall continue to deteriorate slowly, that the atmospheric conditions will continue to deteriorate, and then quite suddenly, I believe, it will all collapse. And I think by the time our grandchildren are our age, that the world will be something like you see in this picture. That's the end. I hope you found it interesting.